Welcome to What's Next, previews, predictions, and prognostications. I'm Rhett Power, your host. My co-host is John Baldoni. Hey, John. There you. Thank you for waving. This show examines what we do now and where we go to prepare for what's next. Whether you own a company or work for one, you need information on what we can expect in the wake of COVID-19. Now, we interview thought leaders and doers from the worlds of business, science, medicine, economics, media, and psychology who can help us shape the new normal. So let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Rhett. We are pleased as punch to have two terrific guests today. A longtime friend of mine, Alaina Love, and a colleague of mine and Marshall Goldsmith 100, Eugene Frazier. Ladies first. So Alaina is a successful consultant and a gifted executive coach and a creator of the Passion Profiler, which is a terrific instrument that I've taken. But prior to that, she was a research scientist for Merck Company and then migrated to HR as a senior executive. So she knows the corporate world very well. She's also the author of several books. Eugene, like Alaina, has a long history in HR. He was a senior HR officer for Motorola for 25 years and traveled the world, literally, helping supervise more than 30,000 employees in probably every country in the world. Eugene is now a master coach and a very successful one, and he spends his time developing and advising senior executives, but also mentoring today. So it's a pleasure to have both of you join our show today. Thank you. Now, Alaina and I know each other, so before our show, we were having a conversation. And I said that if a couple of years ago, if you had given me the choice, and I'm a private person, I don't pry into other people's affairs. If you had said, would you like to talk to a Black person about race, or would you prefer to ask a woman about her sex life? And both would have made me uncomfortable, but probably I would say I would go with the woman question first. So, but Alaina, I am now more enlightened. So why is it very important that we have tough, honest conversations on the race issue?
So. Well, without them, John, we build no understanding. We build absolutely no understanding. So these conversations are difficult. I think they're difficult for people on both ends of the spectrum. The person asking the question because they feel like maybe there's stuff I should know that I don't know, and the person being asked the question. In this case, African Americans, for example, being asked that question right now and feeling like, is it my job really to educate you? Do I have the responsibility to help the rest of the world understand what I believe has been in front of their face for eons, and how come they're now asking me this? So it's tough because it's scary to ask the question if you don't know the answer already or don't know where to find the answer. It's also it can be burdensome to people who are being asked the questions and expecting to educate the rest of the world.
Eugene, you have a take on that question?
So John, if you would, post the question again, because I don't want to, I got caught up in her content because it's very powerful stuff.
Yes.
But just reframe for me.
So for so many of us, it is uncomfortable, I know, for speaking as a white person, to have an honest and tough conversation about race. And one of the reasons, and I was talking to Alaina about this, is because my ego gets in the way. And I think I should know something. So if I ask you something, I'm going to look stupid. So, and Alaina, her take on this, of course, is we have to have these conversations. So I'm flipping it to you.
Okay. So, John, I would say that one of the reasons, well, actually, there's two primary components that I would say are key factors for why we have to have these discussions. And they are cornerstones that I use in my coaching business. And the first one is, what's your personal and professional accountability? And are you committed to making the necessary changes from a behavioral standpoint so that it positions you both personally and professionally, and those who you are responsible for, that you are interacting, collaborating with, all of the above, because no one make a conscious decision to show up and to do a really crappy job at what they do. And that's all grounded in awareness. And how does that position you to interact with people, being real, being authentic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
go
John,
ahead.
to your point, I would also say that I think there's a responsibility. I would say that each of us have, but certainly if we're talking about people at a leadership level, there's a responsibility that we have to engage in conversations that may make us uncomfortable. And for individuals who are in leadership positions now, especially with what's going on in the world, because you have to be, absolutely checked out and with your head in the sand, not to recognize this groundswell of outrage that we're experiencing in our culture, and it's permeating the whole rest of the world. It's not just the United States. So we're in a situation right now where you have to have conversation, and you have to have conversation in an environment where it's not easy. And if you happen to be someone who is particularly conflict averse, this is going to be tough. It's going to be a tough thing to do, but it's absolutely critical to do. And so the leaders who are conflict averse and are really good in their organizations at getting other people to handle the tough stuff, the tough conversations, while they just kind of go on and worry about what do the quarterly results need to look like, are the ones that are going to struggle the most with this, and their organizations are going to suffer because people are going to look at how they behave and the ways in which they are personally showing up. And if those ways are not in concert with a mindset that says we have to embrace the value that everybody brings to the party, and we have to treat people with respect, we have to include them in the decisions that need to be made in our organization. And that means you have to include them in all of the formal and informal networks that exist within an organization. It's not enough to just have them on the team. That's great, but are you including them in the big important decisions that need to be made, or are they just the token person that's sitting at the table? So there's going to be some folks who are going to squirm a little bit through this process, but I think there are going to be a lot more who accept the challenge and engage in conversations that are necessary and ultimately, I hope, healing.
I wanted to sort of get into a question that's been burning in my mind recently, and you got, both of you just set that up perfectly. Is there a need in these organizations to rethink or kind of redo how we think of HR and its role in an organization? And because do we need something like an HR department that's going to drive these conversations, that's going to drive this change? And I think the way we think of HR right now, HR doesn't have the power to do that. Right? It doesn't have the power.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to do typically, Rhett, what I do with you on these kinds of discussions. Before I would answer that question, I want to take us back to something pretty rudimentary as a society, as a overall cluster of people who are distinctly different culturally, geographically, all of the above. And I think that when we approach these things, we look at leaders, we look at individuals who are responsible for organizations, etc. That's very hierarchical in our approach. And leadership really occurs at all levels, even down to the janitorial service, the cafeteria in a given environment. And so what we have to look at is first of all, begin to reframe what differences mean. And how are we approaching that through our rose-colored glasses? Because it's strictly from each one of our perspectives. And so I think we have to focus primarily, how do we reframe the thought process around approaching, interacting, and I'll use the word dwelling with those who are different.
Mm-hmm.
And it really boils down to something very simple, which we somehow in our society has forgotten. And that is essentially focused primarily on what I would call a humanism type of approach. And I'm going to use something really graphic before I get into this, because I need to get everyone's attention. And all of us, when you peel away the layers of the skin, you expose the internal organs of an individual. For those of you who are in the medical profession, they all look the same.
Mm-hmm.
We all have two kidneys, we have two lungs, and so forth. And if you breach the vascular system in terms of our circulation system, we all bleed red. I don't know of anyone on the earth that bleed blue, green, yellow, etc. If they're so, there's something wrong. And so breaking it down to the true element of humanism and treating people the way we personally would want to be treated. And that brings it home from an individual perspective. So with that caveat, Rhett, I want to answer and give a response to your question. I think as I look in my 25 years of experience in human resources, I played roles within medical, health, university, and academic kinds of environments. I've also played roles in a couple of Fortune 500 companies from a HR perspective, AT&T, Motorola. And what I found to be incredibly true, not only in the US, but also across the entire world. Everyone wants to be approached and treated as if they are valued. And no matter what country you're in, people want to be affirmed and appreciated, wherever they may be, wherever they're striving to go. And if I look at historical aspects of how some HR environments are structured, they tend to be more of a roadblock, a counterintuitive type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
waiting for things and issues to come to them. It's not proactive in nature. And this is the kind of activity that's going on right now that requires that we are proactive and that we move away from using traditional, and by the way, I'm a certified employee assistant professional as well. And typically, when people are having difficulty, they want to send you to the EAP department. Most of those have been outsourced, and so they don't have any true insight into the organization and the culture. And when they reside internal to an organization, it works a little better, but that's not, those individuals are no longer equipped to deal with the volatility and the intrinsic issues that are pressing us now with COVID-19 or that of the racial relations around the country. And I would say that a environment, and I'm going to go against the grain here, even though I spent 25 years in the human resource space, I have always set precedent in what I have created. And I firmly believe that the function of an HR environment must be a few things. They must be individuals who are viewed as a catalyst, as a facilitator, also as a structural environment that provides process, structure, techniques, and our strategies that help enable leaders in giving organizations to make their decisions. And I'll use this terminology, first of all, stay in your lane. Your goal really is to set the policies, make sure that the environment is following those policies, and you keep them out of trouble from a legal perspective. But you're supposed to be an enabler of those individuals achieving their goals. But so leave the driving of the business to them, give them tools, give them processes and techniques to thrive in the area that they're looking to innovate and create in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alaina,
Yes.
how would you react to what Eugene was talking about? What tools are necessary?
Well, I think there's a lot of what Eugene said that I agree with, but I have sort of three thoughts, and I hope I can remember all three because they're complex. So the first is that the responsibility of every leader in any organization, especially starting from the top, is establishing the culture that employees experience in your organization every single day. You have that job, right? You have the job for building the house that they live in. And as such, it's one of the most important jobs you have because it's what engages people, it's what helps people be at their best, it's what helps you make sure that the experiences that they're having every single day are positive experiences rather than negative ones, where they're being respected and appropriately aligned with the roles that you've asked them to play and supported in being successful. So that being said, I believe one of the most important jobs HR has is supporting that, is supporting the culture that needs to be nurtured in the organization so that the organization ultimately can be successful. Organizations are, corporations are legal entities, right? It's the people inside them that make them hum. And the people make them hum when the culture they're living in is supportive of them. And the opposite happens when that culture is not. That's when you start seeing fragmentation. So I do believe HR has that responsibility. I agree that all too often I've seen HR departments that used to be called back in the day the personnel department, and I can remember them being called the anti-personnel department because it just felt like you couldn't get anything done, you couldn't get the support you need, and it was the place where you would go and you were sure people could say no. You weren't sure you were going to ever find somebody in those departments that could actually say yes. So that is an issue, and I think if an organization has a department that they're calling HR, that is not intimately involved in structuring how the culture is shaped in the organization and is not supporting leaders in delivering the qualities of that culture that help the organization thrive and prosper, then they're not adding a whole lot of value. I also believe that when it comes to the issue of inclusion and diversity, it's a pretty important issue. And over the years, I have watched that function be tucked under a variety of different areas. It's been tucked under HR. It's been tucked under operations. It's been tucked under legal. There is not one recalcitrant problem that I've ever seen in an organizational setting that didn't rise to the level of the CEO and board. All of them do. The organization's in trouble, when the products are failing, when customers are being lost, eventually that problem, that issue, especially if it's been a tough one to solve, always rises to the level of the CEO, the C-suite, and ultimately the board. Inclusion and diversity is the only thing I've seen that doesn't seem to make it there. We have organizations talking about it being important. We have enough evidence to prove, as we look at demographics, as we look at where money is going to come from and how organizations are going to prosper in the future, and what the complexion of our world is going to look like 10 years from now, that if we don't figure this thing out, companies are going to start losing money. They're going to start losing market share. They're going to start losing customers. If that's not a clarion call for attention being paid to an issue at the C-suite, I don't know what is. So
it's not just one. What drives me crazy about that, Alaina, is it's one person. We make a hire, right?
And they always look like Eugene and I when you make that hire, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's the solution to that then?
Because the solution is that it's a big problem, and like every other big problem, you figure out what are the pieces that are necessary to solve this, and if the organization cares about it, they put money behind it, and they measure it. And stuff that gets measured gets done. Stuff that doesn't get measured, talked about, and it becomes a undercurrent of angst that exists in the organization until something happens and it bubbles up. And here we have right now this perfect storm of stuff happening in our culture, right? We've got a pandemic that has forced people to work from home, that has exposed and exacerbated the racial inequities that individual employees are experiencing. I mean, if I'm an African-American employee and I'm in a quote unquote crucial, essential service, I don't have the privilege of doing what all of us have the privilege of doing, which is staying at home and staying safe, right? I'm out in my community stocking grocery shelves, or I'm, running the bus line, or I'm working the subway, or whatever it is I have to do because I'm in an essential service. And I'm also maybe the relative of an employee that works for a large corporation. And that employee has watched as people in our extended family have become exposed to a virus, are struggling with getting good quality health care, et cetera. So we've got people that are inside organizations or coming back into organizations as various states reopen, who are coming back from having been in a war for survival. They're in pain, they're in grief. They know people who died from this disease. And then we put all of that already large pain body into a situation where we now see these various things happening around the country that are associated with social injustice. And we have this wonderful little thing now that we didn't have years ago. It's this thing, it's called a cell phone, and it's got a camera on it. And so instead of just hearing about these things going on, people are in a situation where they're watching the film over and over again. And they're seeing what has happened to people who look like them. And they're in pain. And then they're coming into the organization and looking at what is this culture I'm in like, right? What are my opportunities here? What's my chance here? Am I going to fare a better chance inside this organization than the guy who was asleep in the car in the drive-thru at Wendy's? Or is it going to be, essentially that for me? Maybe I don't wake up dead through being in this organization, but maybe my career or the opportunities that I might have are absolutely stagnant. So yeah, people are looking at the organization differently, and it's calling us as leaders to figure it out. We're kind of like, how many more things need to happen before we figure it out? This is a pretty big perfect storm as far as I can tell. And I'm hoping we start to work on it before it gets worse, because it's pretty scary to me to think about what else could be layered on top of this.
Well, our customers and our employees are demanding it. And I think that companies are going to be really held accountable if you don't address it. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be the price you pay, I think. Right. We look at what happened at Amazon. Amazon employees said, look, you're saying one thing, you're doing another, and we're not going to take that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what's going to force that change too.
Yeah. And I think,
John, before you move us to the next stage, I want to respond to a couple of things that I didn't add in some of the overview that I provided earlier that really maps to basically what was just said. When I think of processes, techniques, and strategies that really help these organizations to do things differently, there are three cornerstones that whenever I'm creating a process and I'm putting it into the flow of an environment, I'm looking for things that's evidence-based, that I can validate. I can map it back to some level of research first and foremost. And the first component is whatever you create from a process perspective, is it repeatable? Mm-hmm. The second aspect is it sustainable? And then the third one, which is more around recultivating the culture, which is, can you institutionalize that where it becomes first nature to every single person in the environment, which I think is very, very important. But to get to that level of granularity, accountability is in the forefront, because that means people have to have very tangible conversations. The other key thing that I would just say across race relations, and as we look at that within the context of the pandemic, some of the other issues that are going on, and the struggles with people losing jobs, as well as experiencing cutbacks from the top down or the bottom up, whichever one, and the inappropriateness of somehow this occurs. When you have a company that automatically remove a large portion, typically somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population that's truly getting the work done and determining what the revenue lines are, instead of taking dollars from the top and saying, okay, we're going to give this back. We're already making an astronomical amount of money but I want to be able to sustain it. And one of the things that I would just say quickly, so I can give it back to John, is that people are watching how individuals are behaving now. So leaders in organizations, and I tell people all the time when I'm coaching CEOs, presidents, vice presidents, and businesses, people don't watch you in good times because ill will, underlying things are not visible when everything is going well and revenue lines are up. But when the revenue lines began to drop, that's when all eyes are on you, watching your behavior, your spending, all of the above. So I say to leaders out there that are listening to this, be mindful of who you are in good times. Be mindful of how that aligns with bad time. Somewhere in the middle is the true you. How do you continue to be the true you?
Mm-hmm.
It's very well put, Eugene, and it lays up where I want to go. And it gets to what both you and Alaina have talked about. And while we are focusing on HR, when we think about the term institutional racism, the opposite of that is cultural awakening or cultural opportunity. So this is the idea of racial justice, racial equity is far beyond a departmental issue. It is a personal issue, but it is also an organizational issue. And that falls to leaders, as you were saying, both of you, to set the example for others. So, Alaina, what advice do you have for a leader seeking to do the right thing in this area? Is it listen? Is it act? What's the first step?
Oh boy. I don't think there's one first step. I think there's probably a continuum of steps that represent, the first things one should do. As I've written about, if I'm looking at what a leader should do right this minute, a week or so off of what we've just witnessed on the news, I would say the first thing you need to do is listen and let your employees take a breath, because they're all feeling gut punched, and they may not be at their best, at work today. So give them a chance to take a breath and provide an environment, a safe environment for dialogue. I was just, talking to some colleagues earlier today about that exact thing, looking at the tools that we have that are virtual platforms for dialogue, where we can allow people to have conversations with one another. There are other companies that are setting up weekly calls to allow people to just share what they're feeling. We have to get what people are feeling out on the table. And that is a way for us to begin to understand one another and understand what each other's experiences are. So I would say that's a first step. And that leader needs to get busy learning him or herself about what the employees are experiencing. And that means ask questions, listen, keep your mouth shut and your ears open and hear what people have to say. I think the second thing that's important to do is recognize that your culture that you've created is being experienced by these employees every day. They're going to be the best people on the planet to tell you what needs to change about it.
Yeah. Because
they're living it. So if you're not prepared to listen to what they have to say and implement and invite them to make some recommendations and implement those recommendations, that don't even start the conversation because you're not serious about any of this, right? Because those are the folks that are going to be able to say, here are the 3 things that need to change, or here are the opportunities that we've missed as an organization that I think we should revisit. So that piece, I think, is an important part of the equation, and not deciding that when you start to listen to employees, it's only sort of the usual suspects that you gather together, and they're the ones who have a seat at the table and a voice, but expanding how you collect this information and this insight to others in the organization, all the way from top to bottom. Because there are people that are in entry-level jobs in your organizations who are having very different experiences than people who might be just below the C-suite. Their lives are not the same every day, even though they're all walking into supposedly the same building, or virtually the same building. So I think that's a pretty important step to take. And then I think deciding as a leader that you are going to set targets and goals around this issue. You are going to measure this. You have specific things that you want to see happen with respect to this issue by a certain time frame, and you're going to put the support behind it to see to it that it happens. Every leader that I know is measured on something, right? There are a set of objectives that they're responsible for achieving every single year, every single quarter. And if they don't achieve it, they're usually not hanging around very long, right? We find other things for them to do, and it's usually not inside our company. So this is one of those things that also requires it. I also think organizations have a responsibility to seed talent. You can't just go out into the into the market and harvest, the talent that you think is out there and bring it into your organization and figure, oh, I'm done. I just hired, 5 Black people and 4 Hispanics last week. I'm finished. Okay. What are you doing to seed talent being developed and being educated in the community that allows us to sort of grow more and more people who have a variety of different diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds who are coming to the party with the talent and the skills that we need for our organizations. And maybe you won't hire them, maybe one of your competitors will, but if everybody participates in supporting educational programs and internships and other kinds of programs that allow people who are interested in learning about your particular industry, your particular business, and I'm speaking specifically of people of color that are interested in learning these things, then you start to develop a groundswell of talent that exists out there. And I can stop hearing the excuse, I couldn't find anybody. That's why the slate of candidates that I have for every single job I've had open this year are all white people. Or I found a woman. Oh, yay. Okay, so let me get an extra point for that one. Now, I know I sound like I'm being a little bit facetious with some of this, but this is the truth. I've heard these comments made, and I bet you Eugene has as well, over and over again, about how we can't find this, that, and the other. Well, they're out there, but I don't think you're looking in the right place. And what are you doing to seed talent so that you have more of it out there? Seed more women, seed more African Americans, seed more Hispanics, et cetera. You have a role as a corporation in doing that.
And I would say that in what you just said, the roles, if you have a staffing quest, say a given division within your organization as a leader, you have X amount of headcount. And obviously through the pandemic right now, and along with the other issues that are going on from a race relations standpoint, a lot of those requisitions are frozen, however, because people are trying to realize kind of where the balance lie and where do they need to shore up or take out in terms of resources. I've been in situations where I've said, if you got X amount of headcount that's coming into the organization, I put a tax on that internally. And all of my people, I say 10% of your resources, you're going to go get someone who's in that minority status and category. And you can't expense that 10% on anyone else across any other nationality, and it's going to stay there until you find someone. It's amazing what happens when you make that charge. And so that's just one example that you can target and you can set slates. And just like when you're on the diversity side and you have certain comps that you're trying to reach and to balance for the organization, you can do the same with that with your resourcing. I want to take us just for a moment to give a little bit more broader focus in this area, where I talk a little bit about taking leaders back to their most rudimentary foundational level. And when you're looking at people based on the pandemic, the episodes that are occurring around the country from a race perspective, we are in a period of time where we have to take every person back to the basics. What we need to be thinking about now is psychological safety, because it's being breached in every aspect possible. And just learning that overall conceptual framework will help a person to say, what's my responsibility in the stages of how that occur? and then begin to align, create process and or focus that you can execute and follow through with that. The other thing is, this is the period of time where ego structures have no place because they misguide, misdirect, and or foster behavior that is not conducive to any desired outcome that we would like to see different based on COVID and the racial relation issues. And so I would just frame that in that mode for thought process.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Eugene. I was, as I was saying, having a conversation earlier today with my colleagues about some work we're about to do. And one of the things that we're looking at is this notion of creating a safe space for dialogue, but at the same time, using a process that John spoke about when he first introduced me, the passion profiler tool that I've created to assess the passions of the people that are involved in this dialogue process, because clearly we have learned that these deep psychological drivers of behavior and meaning for people are attributes that show up differently. And somebody who has one particular set of passions may respond to this whole situation very differently than somebody who has another. And there are certain people with certain passions for whom the pain of what they're watching and experiencing is severe. And as organizational leaders, we need to understand, are there particular people on my team that I need to give some extra support and attention to? Even if they're not coming forward and telling me that they're having a hard time, I will know based on their archetype who they're likely to be, and how and then I can show up proactively to be supportive, to ask questions, to help them out, to just make them understand, hey, I care. Is there anything I can do for you to help you through this time that we're experiencing right now?
I'm so glad you raised that, Alaina, because so often one of the issues we've of course discussed in our show, and it's in the public discourse, is mental health. It's now being focused on as we come out of a certain wave of COVID. And so what you're doing is equating through your work with the passion profile and other things is heightening awareness of the pain that people suffer. And more importantly, you've provided an opportunity to be proactive. And that's where leadership comes in. And that's, part of leadership is not being comfortable. I mean, when the sun is shining and the wind is at your back, anybody can be a leader. It's when the wind is in your face and the waves are choppy that requires leadership. And I think the thing to say, and either Eugene, if you want to pick it up, what it means to be vulnerable, but also willing to suffer discomfort in addressing tough issues.
Okay. So I would just say, thanks, John. That's a nice lead in to something I was tossing around in my head to share. When you look at leadership, and I talked earlier about removing ego structures, those are veneers, those are safety valves that people surround themselves with so that you can't see the real them, nor are you able to access them. They're not approachable. And I was just going to say, in order to get to a place of psychological safety, if you've been a leader and you've been deceitful, you have been misdirecting and kind of how you operate and treating people poorly, they never forget that. And if the trust isn't there, it's going to be difficult for you to build it. And by the way, trust is not automatically given to you because you have a title and a position. It's an earned technique on a day-to-day basis. So that's the first one I would challenge every leader out there that may be listening to this broadcast. The other key thing is that when we're talking about leadership, we want to show vulnerability. And this is a tough concept for most leaders to embrace. I'm a firm believer that when I show humility, when I show vulnerability, I'm giving you access to a different side of me for exposure and connectivity. It builds a collective bridge to develop a relationship. The second aspect of that, what it does is when I can step back and I can say, man, I can use Alaina as an example. Alaina, I have watched you, observed you over a period of time. I have come to trust your insight, foresight, and how you execute and what you do. I'm entrusting you to go figure out how we fix this particular issue in the organization and come back to me and to share some things. The other thing with that vulnerability is being able to say, we're in a vicarious juncture right now that I have to make some critical decisions and I don't have a clue of where we go next. But I need to connect myself with some people that can brainstorm with me, that can explore and discover alternatives and choices that I can select from. That's showing true humility. That's showing true capability of removing that veneer and ego structure and operating in what I call the real authentic space.
Well, Eugene, I would say that what you've just shared is absolutely spot on. And I would say that there are a lot of people that need to start exhibiting that vulnerability and that authenticity. Because if you think about how many leaders really understand this issue and know what to do, I'll just put a fact and a figure in front of you.
Okay.
In the entire Fortune 500, there are 4 Black CEOs. So the potential for 4 Black individuals who have had some of these experiences that we're all wrestling with right now, who could look and say, I could have been that person or that person that had that experience with the police or had an experience with someone in a park who wanted to, accuse them of doing something other than jogging or bird watching. So we've got a situation where there are a whole lot of people now who can ask that question of themselves. Am I willing to be vulnerable with my team? Am I willing to say, I don't have all the answers? And I'm going to figure out who in the organization or external to the organization for that matter can help me figure out what those issues are so that I'm working and solving the right problem rather than solving the wrong problem really well, right? So we do have a situation where that's absolutely critical. And I think it's going to call CEOs who are used to being, by and large, extraordinarily successful. They didn't get to where they got to because they weren't bright and capable and hadn't figured out some pretty tough things in their careers, who are now in a situation where they're faced with something that's not just happening inside their organization, but that is a larger social problem that is touching everything that's happening in their organization and shining a bright light on the things inside the organization that aren't working and then putting a magnifying glass to it. And they're going to have to be willing to be vulnerable enough to say, I need help. I need help. Because if they really want to solve it, they're probably not going to do it alone. And they probably are going to need to understand what it is they don't understand. And in order to get that answer, you got to be vulnerable enough to say, I'm not sure I know the right way forward.
I'm glad you mentioned the aspect of vulnerability, because in some ways, the watchword on that now is become empathy. We are looking for leaders to be empathetic. And vulnerability was once scorned. And I always like to say that humility, which is something they don't teach in business school, but vulnerability makes one more accessible. And it gets back to Gene's point about saying what you don't know, and I need you to help me. And that's climb down off the pedestal type. And it's collegiality in a sense. It opens things up. So Eugene, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to expound on that a little bit further. I have a clinical background, and I entered into the clinical arena when I was about 23. And I remember working with very affluent brats. And this was an adolescent hospital where I was doing psychotherapy with and behavior modification. And one of the key things that I realized stepping into that, I had clients that were very close to my age, up to about 19, in some cases 20. And so I had to get better at whatever my adolescent issues were. So I got a therapist to help me to be a better therapist. And I would say for people who are leading organizations, that's where coaches come in, who can be a neutral party, can be a confidant, a person who helps you to brainstorm and explore. Step outside, because I have another mantra that I use on a continual basis. If you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? So don't do a makeshift and create a makeshift approach. I'm going to cut the dollars back. This is where investment in you and your development is critical. And if you are having to downsize resources in your environment, what's important to look at is a couple of things. For those individuals who you are exiting, make sure that they exit with dignity, and that they're not sent through unnecessary craziness as they lose their job at the same time. The other one, for those who you will choose to keep and you have separated them from those whom you are exiting, they're going to have the shell shock value of being the remainder. And so work with that, identify the skill set that exists across those teams, shore them up, get them training and development, because now they have to do the works of their counterparts who just left. And so be mindful that what decisions you make, there's a byproduct and a reaction which that automatically falls out unless you're managing it.
I agree with you, Eugene. And I do think also that, you know, when I see organizations or economies enter into tough times, the first thing I see get cut is training. First thing.
Unacceptable.
Without exception. And so when you look at these times, that's where it becomes even more important, that this is the time to invest in your people, not take away from your people, especially when you have individuals who are struggling the way we know employees are struggling right now. And I also believe that the kinds of offerings that you provide to them as far as training goes is beyond just the skill set training that they might need to take on this new hybridized role that they're now in. But what are you doing to offer them the kind of training that allows them to understand themselves better, know how they want to contribute to the organization through being who they are, back to that word authenticity again. Yes. And what are you doing to help them understand how to work collaboratively with one another, how to listen with the intent to understand rather than the intent to find fault. So all of those kinds of programs that we, you know, traditionally have thought of, or many leaders have thought of as soft stuff, the stuff that, that'll be nice to give. Let's do that as a team building exercise at some retreat program that we're having, but this isn't really important. These are the very kinds of things that are going to save your company and that are going to help you retain the individuals that you have and keep them engaged in what they're doing. Because the one thing I can tell you that I've heard repeatedly from people during this time period, and it really began with COVID and people being restricted to stay at home, was that many people came to me and said, you know, this experience has really shaken me. And it has all of this alone time that I've had, and some of them, you know, literally live alone. It's not like their family is with them. So they've had a lot of time to think about what's really important to them.
Yes.
And many of them were telling me, I've got a fundamental question about the direction I'm taking with my life going forward. And I don't know what things are going to look like when this is over, but I do know that I'm pausing right now and I'm really examining where I'm going to go with my life going forward. Well, as organizations, we better be giving people some tools and some anchors, because what I'm really hearing when I hear people tell me that is I feel like I'm floating in the ocean and I'm untethered. I don't have a life raft or anything. Wherever that tide is taking me, I might be going and I'm not sure I want to go there. So we have an opportunity to build engagement, by allowing people to, by investing in people to allow them to develop a greater understanding of self and not be afraid to allow them to examine these questions. Because if you can allow them to examine those questions and then have them see that opportunities exist for them to express who they are through the work that you're asking them to do, that you need them to do in your organization, you're going to win ultimately.
Absolutely.
What is
go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I do want to get a question in. I think this is a great conversation. I want to ask this question. I don't know if it's a bomb or not. It might be, maybe it's a bomb. But we're talking and we're focused right now on racial injustice. But it seems to me that also part of this conversation is gender equity and gender equality. Mm-hmm. And do you think that it's a mistake to, or do you think, I mean, I think, but these are both part of the same conversation within an organization, or am I off base there? I mean, should all this be talked about at the same time?
You know, it's really interesting that you asked that question, Rhett. I was just listening to a podcast earlier today that had 4 African-American CEOs talking about this very issue. And one of them said, you know what? I think if we're going to solve this, we have to uncouple it.
Okay.
We throw everybody into the same bucket. We do a little bit here and a little bit there, and nothing substantial gets accomplished with any of those groups. So okay. It was a female, and she was saying, I really want to know, what are we doing with African-American hires and upward mobility in our organization? What are we doing with the pipeline that we're seeding in our communities so that we have talent to recruit in the future? What are we doing around Hispanics in the same area? What are we doing around women or Asians or whatever the group is? She said, you know, when we couple it all together, we start patting ourselves on the back because we have some incremental improvements in certain areas. And collectively, it looks like we're telling a good story. But if you look at any one group and you look at them over a 10 or 20 year period, you haven't really moved the needle very much. So I think every organization has to ask that question for themselves. You know, is coupling this working for us? Are we seeing significant, substantial improvement in all of these different categories that we think are important to see improvement in? Or are we deluding ourselves because we've seen improvement in one area, but the other ones we haven't seen much movement with? And if you look at the data, it doesn't look like a lot of movement is happening. Not when you look at women of color in the C-suite. Starting from the entry level up to the C-suite, the number drops down to 3%. 3%. So
that makes sense. I mean, because I struggle with it. Like, how do you? I mean, uncoupling it makes a lot of sense to me, but that's you know, I don't know the answer, and I mean, I think that's a legitimate question that companies have to figure out, because it's not working now. So do we uncouple it and really deal with these things in particular buckets, I guess, or however you want to think about it?
Well, I can say that as I said earlier, and we all know this, what gets measured gets done. You know, if we have goals for things that we want to achieve anywhere else in the business, we put a time and attention and focus and money behind it, and it usually gets accomplished. So if uncoupling this is the way it needs to happen in your organization in order for the focus to be what it needs to be to make it happen, then maybe that's a decision a CEO will make. Another CEO might say, no, it's working fine as one entity that we're working on. You know, we're trying to move this monolith forward, and we're going to, you know, take the individual pieces of it and set certain objectives and programs in to accomplish these things. But I want to monitor the whole thing and see what it looks like and see that we're making progress. I don't know that one specific answer will work for every single organization, but I do think the question is worth asking.
And Rhett, I'd like to respond to your post question as well. And you used the terminology gender equity. I would use the word parity.
Parity.
And so when you are in the HR realm and you're looking at the functional disciplines, their compensation, reward and recognition basically is in that arena. And that's a structure that's built based on the culture and the depth of the environment. And when we think about uncoupling, what you're really talking about is re-engineering the structure that has been played out for years and years. And most people don't change those structures too often. So you'll have to re-engineer the structure, technique, and strategies for how things are engineered. That will change the paradigm of how it's approached, first and foremost. The second aspect.
Isn't that what we need to do? Because we're not moving the needle. When
No.
you say that, when we say that there are 4 Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, we're not moving the needle. So
No.
we have to blow it up somehow. The structure and the way we do things has to change. And so, I mean, is that what's the answer to that?
I don't think that, like Alaina said, it's, from my perspective, it's not taking 1 or 2 things that you can permeate across industries and organizations. But if you use the uncoupling approach, where you look at each incremental segment and to say across these things, here's the things we need to do differently to get a different outcome, first and foremost. The other one really starts with, we can't re-engineer culture. What you can do is erode culture by innovating and creating and implementing incremental change. And so you got a cultural aspect that you have to go at in tandem. And the other aspect that's influencing that culture, what are we doing out here in the industry in creating processes, techniques, and strategies that will help facilitate that? So I'll just kind of communicate something I'm working on right now that I'm implementing in the next 30 days. I have developed 2 entities. One is called inclusivity coaching, which is overall that deals with those individuals who are disenfranchised and maybe in certain positions or within organizations that I would approach and or work with them where they are, whether that's region of the world, origin, all of the above. The other aspect that I'm implementing is something called Inclusivity Coaching University. And therein lies process, techniques, and strategies that I'm building right now as we speak to approach this differently. From the time that you're courting a person, interviewing them, changing the process where you allow people to interview you, and positioning yourself that you have the infrastructure inside of your organization that is going to embrace someone who's different. And I use that differences as a broad category because that encompasses everyone, not just race or gender, all of the above. And then along with that, what techniques and strategies do you have in place that has a refinement of onboarding that helps the person to move into the organization and to be retained there? The average high tier, high performer, whether they may be African American or female, they are lucky to make it to 18 months in any given environment before they want to leave. Mm. And that's proven fact based on statistics.
Well, go ahead, John.
No, I know we're getting close to closing out, and so I wanted to thank, and I'm glad what's been good about this program, I think we've addressed human element issues as well as process issues. And while we always want to err on the human side, we need to institutionalize or make it accessible. Otherwise, nothing gets done. We need to be specific in our actions so that our intentions come forward. So,
yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you guys for being with us today. I'd love to. What's the way people can find your book, Alaina?
It's called the Purpose Linked Organization. Amazon is a great place, or my website, which is thepurposelink.com, thepurposelink.com.
Fantastic. And Eugene, where can they find your information?
Well, they can find me a very prevalent space on LinkedIn, Eugene Frazier, and that's E of Choice and Associate. And if they want to access my website to kind of see what I'm up to, they can reach that at eofchoice.com.
Well, thank you guys. John, any last thoughts?
I just want to say thank you, Eugene, for sharing your expertise, and Alaina, longtime friend. Both of you have enriched our conversation, and I hope we've been able to move the needle just a little bit on understanding one another. So thank you both.
And it is my pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the invite.
And thank you both, for all of you, for engaging in this very courageous conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Well, join us for What's Next. We'll be back next Wednesday. Until then, we'll see you. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. And
have a good one.
Have a good one.
Be well.